Live from the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences in beautiful downtown Raleigh. It's the Science Cafe with your host, Chris Smith.
All right, everybody. Let's get this science party started. Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the North Carolina Museum of Natural Sciences. My name is Chris. I work for the museum, which is cool because that means that if you live in North Carolina, you pay for me to do this because I'm a state employee. So welcome to the Science Cafe. I'm your host for this evening. And tonight we've got a cool topic. Did evolution make you do it? Yeah, I've already heard it. Yeah, it's better than blaming anything else out there, right? If you can just say, evolution made me do it. And tonight's guest is Dr. Miles Engel from North Carolina State University. She's a teaching associate professor, teaches animal behavior, biology, and maybe importantly tonight, human evolution. So we can ask her about all those relatives that we have that we're not sure about. Because I bring them up all the time. Did evolution make you do it? You know, so in thinking about tonight's program beforehand, humans have this tendency, or maybe we have in the past, to not think of ourselves as animals, right? Even though we think that what we've built is not nature, but we still live in nature. We just happen to build it, perhaps. And when we look at the way that all the other animals act, it's so easy for us, for scientists, to look at, say, a particular adaptation on a creature and say, oh, well, that particular thing is an evolutionary advantage. Or they do this because from an evolutionary perspective, doing this, it must be better than doing anything else. Why else would it be doing this and still surviving? But evolution tends to be this incredibly twisted and long and winding road, and maybe something works out and maybe something doesn't work out and you end up extinct. But there are also evolutionary things that don't kill you, but that don't make you stronger either. So, you know, that whole song is just bogus. Whatever kills you makes you stronger. Not really. You may just end up with something weird, right? Maybe a behavior, an adaptation doesn't help you, doesn't hurt you, right? Evolution just says if it doesn't kill you, you get to keep it, perhaps. And so I'm curious tonight to find out, what are those things that maybe impact us, how we behave, how we interact in the world around us, and what does evolution really make us do? Maybe that's what I'm most interested in with our speaker tonight, is what is the list of things that I can blame on evolution? That way I don't have to deal with it. I can just tell everybody, evolution did it. It's not me, it's all of us. Get used to it. So, without further ado, please put your hands together and welcome to the Science Cafe, Dr. Miles Engel.
Thank you. All right, you got that in for me?
Ready to go.
Super, thank you. Thanks, Chris, and thank you all. It is great to be here and be a part of this fun Science Cafe series. I appreciate the invite. Before I even get started, I'm just going to real quick introduce this person, Dana Thomas, because I may call on her at some point later, and I don't want you thinking it's just some random person I'm saying, hey, help me out. She is a professional advisor in our biology department, also happens to be working on her PhD, and has a strong background in evolutionary biology, sat in on my course one year, and has been so gracious and generous enough to help me teach it for the past 3 or 4 years. So she knows a lot about this topic too. So if I call on her, that's who that is, yes. So thanks for being here. All right, so this field is a really fascinating one, and as you can just see from the headlines up here, it really is one of the fields of science today that has the highest ratio of primary to popular literature published. So it's not just in scientific journals we're reading about these types of things. It's in Time magazine, on the front cover of Newsweek, and everywhere in between. So it's important. I mean, I think that's obviously that can be very good, getting evolution into the public eye and letting us all be aware of it. But it can have a backlash effect too if the science isn't rigorous and and people start saying, really, is that legit, that sort of thing, or if it's published as if it is fact when in fact it is still theory. So we have to be a little careful about what we read and taking it with a grain of salt and that sort of thing. But nevertheless, this topic in the past decades has really gained a lot of momentum, and we'll talk a little bit about why that is as we go along. So because it's about evolution, I can't start without a picture of this guy and just a little, mention of his very small-ish contribution to the field of biology, something along the lines of natural selection, which basically says that nature, aka the natural piece of it, selects certain traits that are beneficial to organisms. Those continue, as Chris alluded to a minute ago, to be perpetuated into future generations, whereas other traits are eliminated. So this is also known as descent with modification. It's what's referred to here in environmental selection. So it's the environment that is selecting these certain traits. And therefore, we have elephants today, but unfortunately, woolly mammoths and mastodons are no longer with us, right? Okay, so that's environmental natural selection. There's also this other side of the story called sexual selection, which Darwin himself wrote extensively about, was quick to acknowledge, that there's another force at work. It's not just the environment that selects these traits, but it's also the members of the opposite sex who say, hey, I like that, and the peacock on the right gets all the attention from the peahen, where the poor one on the left is kind of left high and dry. So there's also sexual selection. And that's really important because you may be the very best forager around. You might be great at defense. You know exactly where to live. You can outrun every competitor. But if you don't reproduce, your fitness is essentially zero, the same as someone that died early in life. That's what's known as the evolutionary goose egg, and that's why sexual selection proves to be pretty critical. And that is really important in human evolution too, so keep that in mind. Next little thing of background real quick is to mention this, that often when we think about natural and sexual selection, what we're thinking about are physical and or physiological characteristics, which is true. And certainly the bright red cardinal gets all the attention from the females. So those are physical traits that absolutely are selected for. But there's another side to it, and that's behavioral traits. So it goes without saying, given the topic of tonight's, talk, that behaviors can also be selected for. So it's not just that your characteristic makes you more likely to live or die, but the way you act can be very attractive or can be very unattractive, and therefore can mean that you reproduce a lot or that you don't reproduce at all. So behaviors can be selected for as well. All right. So as we start talking about humans, I want to give you this one little piece of background here. And this is a little difficult to see, but I think you can get the main point, which is this, in yellow, highlighted. This is a timeline, a brief timeline from the past 7 million years when we split with our last common ancestor, the chimps and bonobos. But the timeline here that's highlighted in yellow is the Pleistocene epoch, which is the epoch that came immediately prior to the one we are currently in, the Holocene epoch, excuse me. And the Pleistocene lasted from approximately began, I should say, approximately 2.5 million years ago, and it lasted until about 10, 11, 12,000 years ago, somewhere in that range. So that's when the Holocene began. The reason this is important is because, as you can kind of see here, the first Homo genus emerged right there at the beginning of the Pleistocene era, and throughout that Pleistocene, all sorts of radiation of human ancestors was going on, all of which, of course, became extinct with the exception of our own. But there was a lot going on in terms of human evolution during this time period. About 200,000 years ago, so still in that Pleistocene era, is when the first Homo sapiens came on the scene. And about 70,000 years ago is what's known as the cognitive revolution took place, where basically a massive, overwhelming branching out of Homo sapiens occurred, especially in terms of culture, in terms of early language. All of those sorts of things really started to occur about 70,000 years ago. All right, so all of that's during the Pleistocene, and the reason that's important brings us to this next thing. This is all still background. I promise I'm getting to the fun stuff in just a second. But I can't start in on these topics without giving you a little bit of background here. And very much simplifying to make it a little quicker here, but there are lots of different ways of studying the evolution of human behavior. Lots of different approaches. These are probably the three main ones, and this top one, the first one, is without a doubt the biggest in terms of wide dissemination, in terms of number of practitioners. I have former students getting their PhD in evolutionary psychology right now. It is a big field, and most of those popular literature publications are evolutionary psychology based. All right, so evolutionary psychology basically says that, again, back to that timeline, that these adaptations that occurred during the Pleistocene era with our early Homo sapien ancestors, that's what we still carry around with us today. One of the jokes kind of is that our modern skulls house a Stone Age brain. And that's because today our brain, we're carrying around the brain that evolved during that Pleistocene era. So evolutionary psychology, even though it sounds like it might be very psychologically based, it is very Darwinian, genetically natural science based, and says that we have a universal human nature. It studies the common roots of all of our behaviors and says that we have genetically hardwired cognitive traits that emerged during that Pleistocene era that we still carry around today. And what that means, well, obviously we aren't living in the Pleistocene era, and so what that means is that we sometimes suffer something called an adaptive lag, which is what would happen if you took a Neanderthal and put them in the middle of New York City today. And they would be like, you know, obviously a bit overwhelmed. Same sort of deal, that we still have these mismatches today because our brains are wired differently than what our modern society says, right? And that's based on primarily, largely, a genetic standpoint. In contrast, these next two, and again, I'm simplifying because they are a bit different from each other, but the two of these very much focus more heavily on the cultural side. So what they say instead is that humans, we're adaptable. We can go in and change something. So it's like this. Evolutionary psychology would say, all right, there's this environment, and whatever humans came up with the right adaptations, the right behaviors and traits to survive that environment did so. All right, others died out. That's what evolutionary psychology would say. Whereas these two say, okay, there's this human, it's got certain adaptations, it goes into an environment and says, how can I change this environment to suit my adaptations better? So for example, we humans as a species have been living in really cold climates for thousands and thousands of years, very cold climates. Do we have thick layers of blubber and massive fur that grows on us all the time? Of course not. We don't have genetic adaptations to cold environments. Instead, we build shelters, we make a fire, we put on clothes, and that has changed and perpetuated, but it's not genetically based, it's culturally based, right? So there's a very different approach then, and the argument here is that culture can kind of buffer a lot of that adaptive lag, so we might not see those massive mismatches that the other side of the coin kind of argues that we have. All right, so to summarize that, you've got genetic, cultural, two very different approaches. And again, I'm kind of simplifying, talking about the two extremes here, but you can see that one is much faster, genetic in general, cultural is much faster in general than biological genetic evolution is. Cultural evolution kind of grew out of biological evolution, and they very much interact. It's almost impossible to study human behavior without looking at both of them, any given behavior, without looking at both of them and seeing how they interact. But they also can butt heads. For example, genetic evolution can be very much against something that cultural evolution says is great, as in birth control. I mean, natural selection doesn't favor birth control. It's just the opposite. It's all about getting as many genes as you can into the next generation, right? But cultural evolution has said, hey, birth control is an okay thing. It's a pretty good thing, especially in some cultures, right? Another example in that little picture on the right, if you can kind of see it down here in the bottom, here are some early ancestors with fire, and there's a dog in the background. They're presumably cooking over that fire. Cooking fire, coevolution with dogs, which we know has occurred. All of those things are culturally transmitted. We have no innate genes for fire making. In fact, as a species, we're pretty rotten at making fires. But fire making and cooking has transformed us as a species. Our neuroanatomy, our cognitive abilities, our height, everything has been transformed by the ability to cook. And that is not genetic, it's cultural. So you see that there's a very strong piece of cultural, societal influence coming in terms of evolution, and it's something we need to consider. And unfortunately, a lot of times, the flashy headlines are all about, oh, it's in our genes. It's our genes that made us do it. There may be another side. Now, if you put these two together, sorry, I had one quick last example of this, which I think is kind of interesting. A quick example of behaviors. Pure cultural is like dialect of songbirds, dialect of whales. They are not genetically adapted to their local environment to sing in that particular dialect. It is all culturally based, and it's passed on by hearing others. It's relatively new research that shows that certain species of mice build their burrows. It's a totally genetically determined behavior, what the length of that burrow is and whether it has an escape hatch at the back. And that's pure genetically based. And then you can look at other behaviors that are very much an interaction. And dairy farming and humans being a great example of that. That is a purely cultural trait. Again, no genes for dairy farming, but we obviously have been transformed again as a species thanks to that particular practice. And not only culturally have we changed, but we obviously now, across the human species, there are genes for lactose absorption that now exist in our species, which never did before dairy farming. So culture and genes interacting in dramatic fashion in that way. So the takeaway here is this. Evolution happens, and that human behaviors are absolutely a product of our evolutionary history. So it is not a question of whether we can study human behavior from an evolutionary standpoint. It's a question of which approach you're going to use and how much weight you want to give to genes versus culture. All right, so that's kind of the takeaway. But all of the theories will say, yes, we are evolved to act in certain ways in certain situations, whether it's genetic or cultural, and that therefore there can be mismatches. Okay, all right, so let me start with a really simple example, one you're all gonna know. So when you look at foods and or drinks like these, we humans tend to enjoy these types of things. Right? Sometimes we even crave them. Sometimes we can even become addicted to them. All right, so why is it, from an evolutionary standpoint, would humans like these kinds of things? Anybody? Shout it out. Remember, and by the way, it's all theory here. There is no fact, there's no true or false. Okay, give me a theoretical idea why humans would like this. Energy. All right, good one. Energy, and that's exactly it. If you were an adult living in the Paleolithic era and you really did not like sugar, so, you know, just, ugh, no, I'm not eating any sugar. Well, probably you weren't going to have quite enough calories to escape that saber-toothed tiger running you down, or to get your next source of food, or to gestate and lactate a child. So you needed that source of sugar. And obviously these foods are important for that reason. Fermented fruit was a great source of sugar. Both fats and sugars and alcohol give us a hit of dopamine, so there's a genetic release there. So there's a genetic component that we, over the course of our evolution, have been selected to actually seek out and enjoy these foods. It is not conscious. We don't sit there and consciously decide, ooh, I like the way this candy tastes, but we just naturally like it. Okay, so here we have a mismatch, because in the past these things were really important to us and we needed to go after them and get them all the time. And in fact, there's something called a gorging gene theory that talks about how when our ancestors would come across a fig tree laden with fruits, they would just eat everything they could. So if we do that today, obviously we can be in trouble. So here's our mismatch. And one last note about this, and I wasn't even going to say this, but I think this is important. A lot of people, when they see evolution made me do it, or say, or hear, it's in our genes. I cheated on my wife because it's in my genes. Or, you hear all these things and these excuses made for this. Same thing with right here. Just because it is genetically in us to love sweet foods and fermented fruit and whatever else, does that mean we all sit around eating and drinking nonstop every single day? We're all just total gluttons? Of course not, right? So maybe some of us do on occasion, but not all the time. We can overcome it. In other words, it's no excuse to say, oh, it's in our genes and therefore we're doomed, or that's just the way it has to be, or whatever. So just a little side note there. Okay, I want to give you a quick example here. This was an interesting study done not long ago where men were asked to look at videos of women walking and to rate how sexy they were when they were walking. How attractive was that particular walk? And they'd rate them on a scale of 1 to 10 or whatever it was. And then they went back and correlated the stage of the woman's cycle, menstrual cycle that she was at as she was walking. So was she fertile or was she not fertile as she was walking? And they correlated that with her attractivity score for all these men. So given what you know about evolution, what would you predict the results of this study were? Were women more sexy / attractive when they were ovulating and fertile or when they were not fertile? I hear a lot of fertiles. Yes, okay. And the reason for that is get those genes in the next generation, right? Okay. Well, surprise, the results were exactly the opposite. The women who were not fertile were the sexiest. All right, so evolutionary psychologists did this study, and they are coming up with basically an evolutionary reason that, saying that there's a disposition on the part of men to find certain women attractive. So they did, and what they said was that women who are ovulating walk less sexy because they don't want to advertise their fertility and risk sexual assault while they are fertile. Okay, yeah, I hear some chuckling, maybe a few red flags, because the flip side of that is, okay, they walk sexy when they're not fertile because sexual assault's okay then. Okay, right? So here's the deal, and the reason I bring this study up is this. The biggest criticism that evolutionary psychology in particular, a lot of the other aspects as well, but especially evolutionary psychology gets, is that it is so-called a just so story, Rudyard Kipling. In other words, you can take any behavior and explain it in evolutionary terms. And that's tricky, right? Because you probably can, but do we believe everything we read and say, oh yeah, that makes sense, of course? Or is there maybe another side to the story or another way of interpreting it? So in other words, that's a big criticism, so take it with a grain of salt. And with that, let's start some good examples here. All right, road rage. This is kind of a fun one, and evolutionary psychologists have explained why it is in our genes to experience road rage. Anybody want to hazard a guess as to what a theory that could explain road rage would be? Right here. Do you want a microphone? Yeah.
Yeah, I want to hear it.
People have a zone around their body that they don't like other people getting inside of it, and in a car, it's proportional to the car. So when you get inside that zone, you're getting into their
personal
danger
space.
zone. Yeah, personal space.
Yeah. Oh, interesting. That's okay. That's fascinating. That makes perfect sense. It really does. That's a great theory. Anybody else? What's that? Control. Okay, just simply control. That somebody's done something you don't like it, so I'm going to be in control here. Great. So those are super ideas. The one that evolutionary psychology, add something. Bad manners. Yeah.
Yeah, I was going to say that everybody else is less evolved than me.
Oh, well, there you go. That too. Yeah, so the theory that they explain, the way they explain this is that you go back to our early evolution. We lived in very close, small communities, small groups. May or may not be related, but we knew each other. Small villages where everyone knew each other and interacted every single day with the same exact people. And if somebody stole your food away or stole your mate or treated you unfairly and unjustly, you needed to stand up for yourself and say, wait, I'm not gonna take that. Otherwise, they would keep doing it, and everyone else around them would do it. Soon, everyone is stealing your food, and you have no mates. And guess what? Your genes didn't make it to the next generation. So who survived? The ones that said, that's not right. You're not gonna do me. You're not gonna treat me that way. So again, it gets that mismatch, because today in road rage, are these people we're going to see again? When someone cuts you off in traffic, is that somebody you're going to run into the next day or the next or the next? And those witnesses who then see you doing that obscene gesture or chasing them down and attacking them, are they going to really, make a difference in your survival and your reproduction? Probably not. In fact, it might be the opposite, because you put yourself in great danger, right? But regardless, our situation is very different. So this is, they would argue, an example of adaptive lag. All right. Mate choice. This is a fun one, and there's so many analyses and theories about it. But I'm having to really streamline and just hit a couple of the fun ones. I mentioned Johnny Carson in the little blurb, so I've got to bring up Johnny here. So Johnny Carson had 4 wives. His first wife was 4 years younger. His second wife was 7 years younger. His third wife was 16 years younger, and his fourth wife was 25 years younger. All right, but honestly, Hugh Hefner over here has him beat, because his first wife was 3 years younger, his second wife was 36 years younger, and his third and final wife was 60 years younger than he was. Okay, so mate choice. In terms of evolution, let's start with the men. What are Johnny and Hugh looking for in these wives, succession of wives? Young women. All right, what does youth signify evolutionarily? Fertility, absolutely. So men can keep reproducing. So they're looking for the younger and younger wife that can keep reproducing along with them to get those genes in the next generation. Now, I don't care if either of these ever had kids with the youngest of the wives. It makes no difference. The point is that this is what evolutionary psychology at least will argue, is that it is programmed in our genes that men find young women attractive. And there's a whole industry of anti-aging products that supports that, right? So we know that is legit. There is something there, that this attractivity. I read something somewhere that said, if it had been in our genes, if the only way that humans had been able to reproduce was to have sex with armadillos, we would all find armadillos really attractive today. All right, so it really is based upon what got those genes in the next generation. All right, so what about the women here? What did they find so attractive about Hugh and Johnny, especially later in life? Money, exactly, money, resources. So the classic explanation for female mate choice is men with resources. And why are resources important? Children, they gotta have to protect and survive, get those offspring to survive, absolutely. All right, here's another one. All right, so this is talking about what females find attractive. These are some sketches of different waist-hip ratios of men. So in general, who's the most attractive, toward the left-hand side or toward the right-hand side? What do you think? Right. I hear unanimous rights, and that is exactly what all the survey respondents said as well. Women in general prefer a higher waist-hip ratio because they attach that to things like intelligence and ambition. All right, other things that women are looking for, just FYI, apparently, muscles, athleticism, they are looking for height, and facial symmetry. Okay, let's just start with the first of those. In terms of evolution, what would muscles, athleticism, and height get you if you're a woman? What does it signify? Protection. Y'all are so good, of course. So protection is protecting those offspring. In addition, that goes along with testosterone. Testosterone can weaken the immune system, but if you are strong enough to have, muscles and athleticism, it means you've got high testosterone, but you've also got a strong immune system, and that means good genes for those offspring, right? How about facial symmetry? That's kind of a strange one. And that's also preferred by men as well. But anyway, facial symmetry. Health, just general health, good genes again. It means you aren't sick, you aren't, vastly injured and clumsy and falling all over the place all the time, all of those sorts of things. So basically it just signifies health. All right, flip the coin. Who's the most attractive, towards the left or towards the right? Left this time, I'm hearing. A resounding left. Okay. All right. So yes, exactly. And that's the universal favorite. They did this study again with actual photographs that they then doctored to make the waist-hip ratio smaller and larger. And universally, it was that small one that was favored in terms of the women. This was a cross-cultural study done by evolutionary psychologists here in our country. And they also found that waist-hip ratio, the lower one, was associated with higher fertility and, better outcomes in childbirth and that sort of thing. Well, so basically that's kind of the hourglass figure. The 36, 24, 36 is what that is pointing to. What was really interesting, though, is a few years after this study came out, another group went back and repeated it, and they added one additional control to it, and that was familiarity with Hollywood. And when you take out people that are familiar with Hollywood and ask them for the same test, you got very different results, to the extent that some indigenous populations in Peru and Tanzania actually preferred the heavier set woman with the highest waist-hip ratio. All right, so is this an evolved predisposition that men like that hourglass figure, or could it just be culture? Or could it be both? Absolutely. Good question. No answer from me. That's, yeah, okay. So it's just kind of interesting that. All right, quick thing about homosexuality. When we're talking about mate choice, go into a slightly different tack. All right, homosexuality, and we know that, at least in part, homosexuality is genetically determined. So any trait that reduces likelihood of reproducing and getting those genes in the next generation shouldn't be favored. It should die out, right? So why is homosexuality a very robust part of our civilization worldwide today and has been for eons? Any ideas how evolution might explain it? Culture? Genes? Any thoughts? What's that? Professional productivity. Yeah, oh, interesting. That's a great, yeah, exactly. Because they have more professional productivity and therefore they are more successful, and exactly. And their relatives would share some of that. All right, so here are some of the, and there are many ideas about this. This first one is a purely cultural idea. It's a sociosexual kind of explanation for homosexuality, and basically says that homosexual relationships foster cooperation and reduce competition. And this one we know from previous human civilizations, such as the Spartans pictured here, the Japanese samurai, Egyptian house servants. Homosexual relations were not only okayed, but they were actually encouraged and in some cases enforced by mentor-mentee relationships, because they made that group work so much better. So that really the alliance formation theory has a lot of strength in it, especially in times of battle and social upheaval and things like that. And this is mimicked in the animal kingdom, where you see, for example, male dolphins that have sex with each other, and then they go out and find an ovulating female and secure access to her together. Or it's also seen in these apes shown on the right, which are bonobos. Bonobos are equally as related to us as the chimpanzee. They're lesser known relative, but they're equally as related to us. They're the make love, not war species of ape, so to speak. They have sex every day in multiple positions with every combination of partners possible, but sex is used for alliance formation. In fact, if you are a purely heterosexual bonobo, you will not be accepted into that group. You will not gain resources to the same extent as others, and you most likely will have very, very little reproductive success. So it is a critical piece of their society, these homosexual relationships. So alliance formation doesn't explain all the instances of the hundreds of homosexual behavior that exist in other species, but it does explain some of them. All right, some more genetically based explanations include benevolent uncles. So having a gay uncle in the family really fosters the success of nieces and nephews. And this has been widely studied in the Fa'afafini group in Samoa, where this third gender of these men are very well accepted as part of the society, part of the family, all of that. And they truly are regarded as the caretakers of the family. And they do see a vast increase in the success of that family if there is one of these Fa'afafini present in the family. So inclusive fitness, they don't have their own offspring, but they help the relatives' offspring. Now this theory has little to no support in our society. All the evolutionary psychology studies don't find any evidence for its existence. And you probably can understand why. It's hard to care for your kin if you've been rejected by them. And so in a culture that doesn't openly accept and embrace this lifestyle, so to speak, it's not going to be seen to have the strong evidence that it does in other places. The Johnny Depp effect, he's been in the news lately. The Johnny Depp effect is basically saying that there are many genes that code for homosexual behavior, and that you can have any number of those genes. You might reach a tipping point at which you are now a gay male, but it could be that you're a heterosexual male and you just have some or a few or a lot, whatever, of those genes, and it gives you traits like these: nurturing, and makes you more empathetic and more communicative, and women find that very attractive. So those genes overall in the population continue to persist, even though there are some individuals that may have lessened reproductive success. As a whole, the genes continue to be out there in our population. And then finally, this one, the sexy sisters, this also has some support from the Fa'afafini, where if you are a grandmother and you have a Fa'afafini son or grandson, you are almost guaranteed to have more children, grandchildren, great-grandchildren than if you don't have a Fa'afafini son or grandson. It actually, I guess, should be called the sexy grandmother hypothesis. But I guess that doesn't sound quite as catchy. At any rate, but sexy sister hypothesis says that probably a gene on the X chromosome, something along those lines, that would cause a male to prefer other males. It gives his sisters a huge reproductive advantage so that she's more fertile and has more offspring. So it actually goes along with that inclusive fitness. And there's quite a fair amount of evidence for that one. The point of all of this, though, is that obviously homosexuality has been selected for in the course of our human evolution, whether it's genetic and/or, probably, and cultural, and that we as a species, just like gender, sexual preference and sexual preference diversity is something that is very much on a spectrum. So whereas one individual may say, hey, I'm way at this end or I'm way at that end, as a species, we are all over the place, just as are many other types of animals. And that's one of the takeaways from comparing our behavior to other species. Xenophobia, I'm going to mention this one briefly. We spend like 3 or 4 weeks talking about this one in our class. It's a hefty one because it leads into racism and all sorts of really hard, tough discussions. But I want to mention it in terms of evolution. So xenophobia is basically when you fear or distrust someone or a group that is not your own. So why would it be that humans as a species would benefit in our evolution from fearing or distrusting another group? Okay, resources. That's a big one. Yeah. Good. So you're more likely to stay safe if you know that this is my group, I stay within it, I'm safe. You avoid a place where you might be putting yourself in danger. Absolutely. And that's what it boils down to. So that essentially cooperation, cohesiveness within groups was very beneficial, and those groups that shared that became more successful over time, whereas those that didn't and that didn't recognize their own group may have had less success. So you're willing to share your resources, to risk yourself, those sorts of things for others that you would expect will return the favor later. They know me, I know them, we're all in the same group together. Whereas if you share some valuable resources with someone way over there in that other group, you may not ever get that favor returned, and you've just lost out on something valuable. So actually there's strong theoretical evidence that children 50,000 years ago, back in that Pleistocene era, were programmed to kind of recognize their own group, whether through the types of food they ate, the place they lived, their different habits, et cetera, and so that we're kind of hardwired to say, hey, this is a group, and we learn through experience what group is our own. What's really interesting is that there's a genetic basis to this, and that's found in oxytocin and vasopressin, and this fascinating research going on in this field right now. But the stronger the bond becomes between members of the same group, the stronger the hostility becomes toward members of another group. So it's the same thing with monogamous mammals, in fact. When they start mating with each other, they form that bond, oxytocin is released, they form a strong bond together, and at the exact same time, they become increasingly aggressive toward anyone else who comes around them. It's all because of oxytocin and vasopressin. So then you can say the more loyal you are to your school, the more fiercely you're going to cheer at the basketball and football game, because they go hand in hand. They really are kind of one and the same in terms of our evolutionary roots. All right, last one I'm going to mention is this one, and it's kind of a weird one. Dana, I'm grateful, said for me to leave it in here, because cooperation and altruism as a human species, this is something that, has been written, books and books have been written about it, and there's so many ideas about where it originated, everything, from our morality and what we share with other primates to religion's influence, et cetera, et cetera. But cooperation and altruism, and menopause as a side note, has a very strong and unusual evolutionary explanation. Anybody want to hazard a guess what it is? It's what? Yes, you got it. I wish I had a prize to throw out to you. Yeah, it is. It's child rearing. It's cooperative breeding. So cooperative breeding, like meerkats have, cooperative breeding is something that's been in our species as far back as we look through that Pleistocene, Homo sapiens. It evolved very, very early on. And basically it's saying, and you can think about your own life, you know that you have been influenced in terms of where you are today by people other than your actual parents. So if there's anyone in your life that has influenced you and helped you become who you are other than your parents, you are a result of cooperative breeding. And the fact that we all have grandparents, aunts, uncles, neighbors, babysitters, and teachers who have helped us become who we are today says that we rely heavily on cooperative breeding. We send our kids out into the world, off to school, whatever it is, and say, hey, take care of my child. That's cooperative breeding. All right, so cooperative breeders share some interesting things. They're very tolerant of others who are not like them. They are very responsive to the needs of others. They donate food, they teach. And then, in red here, they demonstrate something called spontaneous prosociality. We humans have been regarded as a spontaneous, to our default mode to be spontaneous kindness. That comes out of this idea. Spontaneous prosociality says we will immediately help someone who needs help or reach out and do whatever we need to do without any forethought. And especially if that individual is a little person. If there's a child or infant in need, we just can't help ourselves but help, right? You almost would have to fight the urge not to. That's cooperative breeding. It is a hardwired piece of who we are. So here's what's interesting. You take that psychological aptitude for cooperative breeding that we share with a few other primates, marmosets and tamarins in particular, so that spontaneous prosociality. Combine that with our amazing cognitive abilities, our intelligence that we share with apes like chimpanzees. You combine those two, what you end up with is us. No other species has both the incredible intelligence and the cooperative breeding. So it helps to explain, in large part, how we have made these massive civilizations and technology, not only because we're intelligent, but because we can work with others, even others who are not our best friends. We can get along with people. We can cooperate. So you put those two together, and it's really a case of here's where our uniqueness comes from. I think that's just so fascinating. And then as a side note, cooperative breeding also helps to explain one of the main theories for the existence of menopause, the grandmother hypothesis, saying that back in that Pleistocene, when that environment got very dry, newly weaned children couldn't go and dig up the tubers on their own very well, so their grandmother, older women, would come along and help them. And women who lived longer and could help the grandchildren do that passed on those genes for longevity to their daughters, who helped their grandchildren and passed on those genes for longevity to their daughters, et cetera, et cetera. So it's one of many explanations for the existence of menopause. So that is where I'm going to end with examples. But before I close, I want to make one final point, and that is that while obviously I think studying where we come from and all of that is hugely fascinating, intrinsically interesting, and important to understand what we share with other species, what our roots are, et cetera, I think there's another side to it. And I think that it's not only about understanding where we come from and how similar we are to other species, but it's also about recognizing our uniqueness and saying, you know, there are a lot of things that, for example, unfortunately, a lot of them are bad: racism, sexual discrimination, environmental degradation. We don't share those things with other species. That's all us. That's culture. That's society. It tells you what a tremendous impact our culture and society has had on us as a species. And I think as you study this and recognize both our similarities and our differences, it helps to not only see where we've come from, but maybe gives us a little bit of push to go in the right direction and to show responsibility toward each other and towards our planet and all of that good stuff. So I think there's a lot we can learn from that. I've been so privileged to teach this class to undergraduates and see them change in the course of a semester and their eyes open and them say, wow, I'd never thought about it that or realized that connection or the importance of society in terms of the way we operate. So it's kind of an interesting field. As we said, there's no right or wrong, but it's a lot to think about. And that's where I'll end.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Fabulous stuff. All right, let's see who has the most evolved questions. It's a terrible joke. Q&A time, the way it works is we'll pass mics around, so every now and then find me or find Katie, wave at us so that we know that you've got a question. We'll try to get a microphone to you, and we'll try to get to as many people as we can in the time that we have remaining. First one is right over there.
Yes. I much enjoyed your talk.
Thanks.
What's the difference between cooperative breeding and xenophobia? They seem to be opposed.
Yes, they very much are. You're right. So cooperative breeding, though, most likely was within our kin groups, our social group. So cooperative breeding, so I didn't go into this, but there's this idea that there were these groups called ethnies, which were extended groups, but shared the same general habits, culture, food preferences, as it evolved, clothes, et cetera, and that we very much evolved recognizing our own ethnies. And the theory of cooperative breeding is that it happened within those ethnies. So it kind of would coincide with xenophobia. So you were helping and automatically helping, but it was those that you trusted to an extent. So as our groups have grown, obviously now those ethnies have kind of intermingled, but we still have that cooperative breeding. It's now been forced into a different context. But you're exactly right. They very much are kind of opposed to each other in that regard. I think xenophobia and the recognition of differences is not something that forbids you from, getting along with other people or that sort of thing. And that happened early, or, probably 10, 11,000 years ago. We were still out of that ethnocentric kind of group, but we were still able to, recognize differences even if we didn't just act on them. Does that make sense? So they could start to intermingle a bit. Yeah.
Odd question, but how did menopause evolve when most people died before they got to be that old?
That's a great question. I'm not sure I could really explain. There are a number of theories about it, but it was not that they were that old. It's just that they weren't reproducing, so their reproduction had slowed down. So at this point, they may have been 35. So they were 35 helping their grandchildren to dig up those tubers. And then obviously over the course of thousands and thousands of years, that got pushed out farther and farther. killer whales, orcas, also have grandmothers, quote unquote. They're the only other species that the female stops ovulating and helps her son, in this case, with offspring. And that grandmother hypothesis very much holds up with them as well. So there's at least one other species that we can say might follow the similar pattern. But yeah, it would have started at a very early age and been minimal. Yeah. Oh, okay.
Yeah. How do you sort out all the confounding factors in determining whether a trait is genetic or cultural or a mixture of the two? It's specifically altruism. You know, an altruistic person isn't necessarily going to contribute any genes into the future.
That's true.
So what's the genetic basis, or is there one? Is this purely a cultural thing?
Yeah. Well, first part of that question is I don't think there is an easy way to do that right now. We don't know how to separate those two and say, hey, this is genetic, this is cultural. Would you not agree with that, Tana?
So they are doing these things now where they're sequencing entire genomes of a large group of people and then trying to do these correlational studies with like, oh, these people are more intelligent or altruistic or have a higher level of education, and then they have these genes. Oh, really? Yeah. So, I mean, it's very imperfect, but it's, yeah, and that's what makes this whole class and topic so interesting and complicated.
Yeah, so there are some ways to get at it, but altruism, for example, you're right, but it's very, that it would not necessarily promote your own genes if you were self-sacrificing to the point that you did not survive and reproduce. But altruism as a whole across the board would have been very selected for, because those individuals that were altruistic were seen as having the means to be altruistic. It kind of ties into that whole handicap theory, if you're familiar with that. Like the ones that donate the most food, they're birds, for example, that will donate food to other birds, but they're typically the dominant male, and he'll have this special loud call and advertises the fact, hey, look at me, I'm about to donate food. And all the other females will look around and say, ooh, he's donating food. He can handle giving away some resources. So in other words, even if it's not a conscious decision like that, those that were willing to donate and to risk themselves to help others would have been attractive to the opposite sex. So you would expect that altruism, and would have made them work better with the group, so that altruism would have been favored over the course of time, even though there would have been exceptions to that, and those individuals might not survive. So there could be a genetic basis to altruism, and I think, and I might be speaking a little out of turn, but I think there is some evidence that it is very much, or at least in part, genetic. So that both cooperation and altruism have genetic roots to them.
Yeah, Richard Dawkins sort of takes the opposite
Yeah.
opinion on that. He doesn't believe there is a gene for altruism because basically, from his point of view, we're just ways of getting genes into the next
Absolutely.
generation.
Selfish gene, that's right.
Yeah.
That's right, exactly. So that's what I mean. There are just so many ways to interpret all of these things, which is what makes it fun, but also, you know, infuriating at times, because you just want to know, what is it? Yeah, I don't know, but it's interesting. Yeah.
Has anyone looked at, within a species, has diversity increased over the years within a species, so that, you know, the story right now seems to me like, well, we had some hardwired stuff, and that was kind of what makes our species what it is, and then all these cultural things happen, but could it not be that if diversity increases within a species over time, that the wiring also changes over time, and that's not that's evolutionary too, and it's not just culture, or it may start out as cultural and end up being fundamental,
and then end up being genetic, in other words, because our cultural practices, like we said with dairy farming, for example, so that the culture may end up changing the genes, and now, whereas you started with a diversity of cultures, you now have a diversity of genetics as well. Yes, that is entirely plausible, and I would say that there is some evidence of that happening in certainly in certain populations. For example, in Tibet, where they're very adapted to living at high altitudes, or those sorts of things, where we can see genetic change has happened in populations in a relatively short period of time. So I don't know if that quite answers your question. You want to follow up? Feel free to. I'm not, but yeah, that is entirely possible, and that's a great example of that interaction between culture and genes, and that it's so hard to just isolate one without addressing the other. Yeah.
So is the adaptive lag that you talked about, I assume that happens in all species or in lots of different species, but would you say it's a bigger deal or maybe even a bigger problem in humans because we have, at least currently, because of humans' exceptional intelligence, we have social systems and technology changing at a really rapid rate, much faster than perhaps our biological, responses to
or than bunny rabbits living out in the field.
Yes,
absolutely.
So things like, you would think multiculturalism or the appreciation of diversity would be a great response to a more globalist society and economy, and yet obviously that's a super hard thing to pull off.
Right, exactly. So true. But yeah, so adaptive lag, I think, well, there are lots of arguments about whether it's occurring and to what extent and that sort of a thing. But yes, first of all, we as a species experience adaptive lag, it's thought, much more than any other species. And that's because of our very rapid intelligence and cooperation that allows our societies to change at such a rapid pace, right? So if suddenly the society is very different just in 100 years, think of where we've come, then you could say, oh, we're already starting to see an adaptive lag. And those of us that can't figure out how to do this in our technology are experiencing it, right? So that adaptive lag in humans is definitely occurring faster and more explicitly than we see in any other species because of our non-genetic cultural transmission of those ideas and technologies and that sort of a thing. Yeah, so it's an interesting phenomenon, to say the least.
It is, to say the least. But there's the penguins and even the geese, family oriented, they stay there with the mate that they pick.
They're monogamous.
And the thing of it is, they say that if a penguin's mate dies, the penguin normally usually dies not long afterward because he mourns to death for his mate. But when she dies, he feels as if part of him is already gone. And that's phenomenal, that's interesting. That the birds, that they would have this feeling.
Yeah.
And it's really interesting how, because some dogs will, for example, mate, or cats will mate with another dog or, cat, depending on species. And they'll mate with them, but they'll maybe mate with a different one at another time. But penguins, when they do that, or geese, they pick a mate, they stay with them to that mate.
And that may be part of that bond, that oxytocin, getting back to that we were talking about.
It's fascinating. It's interesting. That
strong bond that is formed. Yeah, absolutely. I think it's interesting, and the adaptive lag question, the cultural change kind of touched on this. There's a lot of thought that we humans are adapted to change itself. And I think that's a really interesting idea, that we as a species, Homo sapiens, as opposed to all of the other human relative in the past, are still here today because we are so darn adaptable, because we really are pretty darn clever at figuring out how to get along in a new situation by working together, by our intelligence, by designing clothes to make us, whatever it is, but that we really are kind of adapted to change. And there are not many other species that are that way,
So we're pretty special.
Yeah.
I like that.
We're pretty special, I guess.
I do have one question.
One more question?
So this research, how is it used? How do you use this research, or what is it?
That's a great question. And I don't know that I don't know the use of it per se, more it's just something that we feel like we want to know because we are so curious to know where we come from. It also helps to inform our relationship to other species, certainly to our close relatives, primate relatives. And like I said, hopefully it helps us to understand and tease out what piece of things really are genetically controlled and that we, you know, are going to have to deal with, and what pieces are culture and society that we could change if we wanted to, right? So xenophobia, maybe that's somewhat in our genes. Racism, that's pure society. And that, so being able to recognize those differences will help us to, I think, take better care of ourselves, each other. Yeah.
Let's give her a round of applause. Thank you very much for being here. Okay, yeah. And you're fun. And thanks to all of you for being here at the Science Cafe as well. Thanks for coming out this Thursday night. And let's see, next Thursday, you do not want to miss. Actually, the next two Science Cafes, you don't want to miss them. Next Thursday night, we're doing the science of ice cream. And I heard there's going to be ice cream from North Carolina State University's own dairy. What is it? From food science at NC State. So there's going to be ice cream next Thursday. And then in 2 weeks, meteorologist from WRAL, Greg Fischel, is going to be here on the stage. So you don't want to miss the two next Thursdays. And hey, since we were talking about bad decisions, tomorrow night here at the museum is an event we call Natural Selections. It's our Science of Beer night. Tickets are still available, but only a few. That's not a bad decision to come to the museum. The alcohol part was my connect. Anyway, Natural Selections, we're going to have a lot of fun. We've got live science demonstrations. We have something like 25 local North Carolina brewers. You'll be able to sample their wares at the museum. naturalsciences.org for all of the information. And hey, if you want to keep in touch with us so that you know what's coming up all the time, at the bottom of the feedback form there's a spot where you can write down your email address. We'll add you to the list so that you know everything that's happening all the time here at the Museum of Natural Sciences. Folks, thanks for coming out tonight. We hope to see you again real soon. Good night.